Big Shaq's luxury yacht wasn't just a boat, it was hope afloat. When a racist cop set it on fire, they didn't just burn steel. They tried to sink a movement. But fire can't drown legacy. What came next didn't just shock everyone. It shattered the silence that protected the system. Because Lucille's dream didn't die in the flames. It rose from them. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Big Shaq had always been larger than life, but in this particular coastal stretch of northern Florida, his size wasn't what people remembered most. It was the silence with which he moved, the way he listened without interrupting, laughed from the gut, and bent low when shaking hands with children. He had traded the limelight for something quieter, more sacred service, and unlike most millionaires who dipped into charity for optics, Shaq didn't post pictures or quote statistics. He just showed up, every time. After retiring from the NBA, after endorsements and late-night shows and reality TV came and went, Shaq had turned toward a different kind of arena, one where his wins couldn't be measured by trophies or net worth. In a town known more for its historic lighthouses and generational prejudice than for progress, Shaq had quietly purchased an abandoned marina and rebuilt it into something extraordinary. It started as a hobby, refurbishing an old yacht to honor his mother, Lucille. But over the years that hobby turned into a mission. The yacht, which he named Lucille's Dream, was more than luxury. It was liberation. Each weekend, groups of Black and Latino kids from struggling neighborhoods in Jacksonville and Orlando were driven down to the dock. They boarded not to sail into paradise, but to see what dignity looked like when it floated. The yacht was a space without metal detectors, without judgment, without anyone demanding they speak properly. Inside Lucille's Dream, they read books under the sun, learned about financial literacy, recorded podcasts, and heard stories from Black historians who spoke with truth and fire. It wasn't a classroom, it was something better, a floating freedom school. Shaq never asked for thanks. His eyes would light up when a teen who once refused to talk eventually asked how to open a Roth IRA. Or when a little girl clutched her sketchpad and told him she'd drawn a better version of the yacht for the future. He always made time for those kids, even if it meant delaying meetings or missing out on TV deals. He was building something bigger than fame now. He was building legacy. The town of Crestford was a strange place. It wore its southern hospitality like a crisp white shirt, tidy, charming, and concealing old stains. On the surface, the locals smiled at Shaq, shook his hand, called him, but some couldn't quite hide the way their eyes narrowed when they passed the marina. Beneath the charm was discomfort, resentment, even. Not just because he was rich or famous, but because he had dared to give without asking, dared to exist without permission. Lucille, his mother, often reminded him to be careful with his heart. "Son, they loved Jesus on Sunday and hung him on Friday," she'd say, her voice steady with wisdom. But Shaq had always believed people could change, that compassion could wear down hate over time. He held on to that belief, even when others told him not to. His daughter, Mayara, was the other flame in his life. 17, brilliant, and about to start her first year at Columbia on an academic scholarship. She had grown up learning the difference between charity and justice. While most kids her age were filming dance videos, Mayara had been helping her father coordinate internships for teens from the Yacht program. Shaq used to joke that she had her mother's brains and his stubbornness, and he'd never been prouder. But change, real change, rarely came without cost. And in the heat of summer, as the yacht swayed gently in the bay, unseen tides were beginning to stir. It started with small things, a maintenance report gone missing, an event permit that took weeks longer than usual, a cold shoulder from the Marina Council. Shaq noticed. He always did, but he gave the benefit of the doubt, convinced it was bureaucracy, and not malice. Still, something gnawed at the edges of peace. On a sticky afternoon in late July, while Shaq stood on the dock talking to a group of returning students, a shadow stood across the water. A man in uniform, tan shirt, mirrored sunglasses, black boots, watched them. He didn't speak, didn't wave, just stared. He looked like any other officer from the sheriff's department, but his posture carried something heavier. Not duty, not curiosity, resentment. The kind that doesn't shout, but waits. Shaq caught a glimpse of him just before he turned to leave, disappearing behind the bait shack. Later that evening, Shaq walked alone along the dock, shoes in hand, letting the boards cool his bare feet. The wind carried the smell of salt and oil, familiar and grounding. The yacht rested quietly in the harbor, its lights off, its hull shimmering silver blue under the dying sun. He ran his hand along the railing, thinking of Lucille and Memora, of the kids whose futures still floated on these waters. He didn't know then that someone had already decided Lucille's dream was a threat, that in the undercurrent of silence, something ugly was preparing to rise. But he felt it, like the heaviness before a storm. And in that moment, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, the quiet giant looked out at the water and knew peace, no matter how carefully built, was never guaranteed, especially not here. Deputy Wade McKellen had served in the Crestford Sheriff's Department for 15 years, and in that time his name had become synonymous with law and order, or so the local papers said. But behind the polished badges and morning handshakes, Wade carried a different truth, one stitched deep into his upbringing, where control was mistaken for justice, and power was a birthright passed from angry fathers to obedient sons. Wade didn't see himself as corrupt. He believed in the system the way some people believed in gravity, and in his mind the worst crime of all was disruption, especially when it came from someone like Shaquille O'Neal. Wade had watched Shaq from a distance for months. He rarely made contact, never issued citations, but he was always there, patrolling near the marina, even when his beat didn't require it, circling past charity events in his cruiser, staying silent at town meetings where Shaq's name was brought up in applause. To most, Wade was invisible. To Shaq he was a shadow with too much interest and too few reasons. It wasn't just race. It wasn't just class. It was something deeper, an unease Wade couldn't articulate. Shaq had something he'd never been allowed to want: admiration. Not the kind you demand at gunpoint or earn through fear, but the real kind: community love, unwavering trust. People didn't fear Shaq. They leaned on him. And to Wade, who had spent a lifetime building his authority from intimidation, that made no sense. It made Shaq dangerous. Wade came from old roots in Crestford. His grandfather had been sheriff before integration, a man who'd held rallies at the courthouse steps to defend Southern values. His father was more discreet but no less bitter, retiring with honors while still using words like them and those people when referring to anyone who didn't look like him. Wade learned early on that history never really left. It just dressed better. He saw Shaq's philanthropy as a threat, an unwanted mirror to the town's failings. Every new program, every smiling family walking off that yacht, every child who spoke with pride instead of fear chipped away at the illusion. Wade worked so hard to protect that Crestford didn't need saving, that the system worked just fine. The first sign that something was coming didn't arrive through confrontation, but caution. Late one evening, as Shaq reviewed proposals in his marina office, a modest building tucked beside the dock, he received an envelope. No postage, no return address, just his name, printed in thick capital letters. Inside was a single sentence, typed in black ink: "They're watching the boat. Be careful who smiles at you." There was no signature, no follow-up. Just that. Shaq read the note twice, then a third time. He scanned the marina from the window, but all he saw were the silhouettes of shrimp boats rocking in their slips. He placed the note in his drawer and locked it. He didn't mention it to Lucille or Mayra. He didn't call the police. He told himself it was paranoia. Someone playing games. Maybe even one of the teens pulling a bad prank. Still, that night he made a slow walk down to Lucille's dream. His footsteps measured, his eyes scanning corners he normally ignored. Inside the sheriff's department, Wade was already working the angles. He couldn't touch Shaq publicly. The man was too loved, too connected. But he could make things uncomfortable. An unannounced fire inspection. A delayed permit renewal. A few parking violations stacked up in front of the marina's supply truck. All legal, all explainable. Wade understood how pressure worked. It didn't have to break someone. It just had to bend them enough. And still, Shaq never confronted him. He greeted him with the same nod he gave the mailman. It was infuriating. The more Shaq refused to react, the more Wade needed him to. Not for revenge, but for confirmation that the balance of power still tipped in his favor. There were whispers in town, of course. The younger officers noticed the pattern. One of them, Deputy Claire Mercer, began logging Wade's unassigned patrols near the marina. But no one spoke up. Not yet. Crestford didn't reward whistleblowers. It buried them in procedural reviews and quiet transfers. Mimura noticed something too. She asked her father one evening why the same cruiser always circled the dock on Sundays. Shaq had smiled, told her not to worry, told her that sometimes people get curious about what they don't understand. But inside, a subtle tremor began to grow. Not fear, not yet, just the weight of something unspoken. Meanwhile, the yacht kept sailing. Every weekend, more children boarded, more stories were shared, and more hope took root. That was the part Wade couldn't stomach. No matter how many veiled roadblocks he threw up, Shaq kept building. Then came the day Wade stood at the far end of the marina, outside his jurisdiction, leaning against his unmarked cruiser. He wore civilian clothes that day, blue jeans, a tucked polo, but the stance, the watchful eyes, the aura of surveillance hadn't changed. He held a cup of coffee he never drank, and didn't speak to anyone, just watched. Shaq saw him. So did the staff. No one said a word, but something shifted in the air. Suspicion became presence. Presence became pressure. That night, as Shaq locked the dock gate, he glanced back at the yacht. Its lights glowed softly from the lower deck, casting ripples onto the water like a lullaby. He thought of the note again, the warning, and for the first time he wondered whether ignoring it was the right call. In a town where the badge spoke louder than facts, and history whispered beneath every handshake, Shaq understood what fear looked like. But he had never been one to flinch. What he didn't know, what none of them did, was that someone else had just stepped past the line between intimidation and sabotage. The dock creaked gently under his feet as he walked away, unaware that a plan was already in motion. One not meant to scare him, but to silence him. And the next time he would stand at that same spot, the water wouldn't be calm. It would be burning. It was a Sunday thick with heat, the kind that hung in the air like an accusation. Shaq had just returned from a breakfast meeting with a group of educators who were helping build the yacht's mentorship curriculum. He parked his truck in the usual gravel spot beside the marina, nodding to a few local volunteers setting up chairs under a canopy. That afternoon, 23 students from across the state were scheduled to board Lucille's Dream for a weekend summit in coastal conservation and storytelling. For them, it was a chance to speak, to be heard, to believe their voices mattered. For Shaq, it was another brick in the bridge he was building for kids who were too often left behind. The yacht shimmered under the Florida sun, anchored just far enough from the dock to sway gently in the tide. Its white frame glowed like a symbol of promise, its deck already prepped with name tags and water bottles. Everything had been triple-checked. Shaq's team never left things to chance, especially with kids involved. As he stood under the shade of the dock's roof, sipping sweet tea and listening to the laughter of the setup crew, there was no warning, no sign, just the loud, blunt crack of reality tearing open. A boom split the air like the sky itself had been punched. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't a wave hitting shore. It was something unnatural, violent without being loud. An ignition. All heads turned toward the water. At first it was a whisper of smoke, gray, slow-moving, almost graceful as it curled upward from the yacht's lower deck. Then, with terrifying speed, the smoke thickened, blackened, and exploded upward in a bloom of fire and fury. Flames clawed their way up the vessel's side, licking at the railings, shattering windows, feeding on everything they touched. The sound changed, wood splitting, metal groaning, the horrifying crackle of something sacred being swallowed by heat. For a moment, no one moved. Shaq's cup dropped from his hand, clattering against the wood. He took 2 unthinking steps forward before the reality hit. No one was on board. The summit hadn't begun yet. The students were still in. That knowledge slammed into his chest like a life preserver hurled just in time. But the relief was short-lived. Lucille's dream was dying. The fireboat arrived too late to matter. By then the hull was scorched, the nameplate charred, the heart of the vessel split in half by the flames. Onlookers gathered along the boardwalk in stunned silence. Some pulled out phones, others simply stared. Children cried. Grown men stood with hands over mouths. Shaq didn't speak, didn't cry. He stood still, as if absorbing the fire himself. By early evening, the marina was cordoned off. There were no sirens, no detectives, no crime scene tape. The local fire chief, a man who had known Shaq for years, offered only a brief explanation: an electrical fault, a short circuit, possibly an overheated engine room. Nothing suspicious. Nothing to report. The dockmaster, an old man with kind eyes who'd once built model ships with Shaq after hours, mumbled that the official report might take weeks, maybe longer. Shaq knew better. This wasn't mechanical failure. The yacht had been inspected, cleaned, maintained religiously. Every inch of that vessel had been double-checked just days before. The engine hadn't even been powered that morning. It wasn't wear. It was sabotage. And someone knew exactly when to strike. Back at the house that evening, Shaq sat in the backyard, under the porch fan, his hands locked together, his phone untouched beside him. Mara came outside, said nothing, and simply leaned against the railing. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with grief, questions, and a slow-burning fury. But Shaq didn't explode. He never had. Instead, he let the weight settle in his chest like a permanent guest. The dream had burned. The mission hadn't. The next day, whispers began. A teenager from the neighboring dock claimed he'd seen someone in uniform near the marina early that morning, alone, walking without purpose. A marina employee said she'd noticed a cruiser parked 2 blocks away an hour before the flames. Engine idling, driver never exiting. But none of it made it into reports. No one came forward officially. Fear was an old tenant in Crestford, and its rent was paid in silence. 3 days later, a video surfaced online. It wasn't high resolution. It was taken from a motion-triggered wildlife camera mounted near the bait shack. The footage showed a figure moving past the dock's edge around sunrise. The man was tall, heavy-set, wearing what appeared to be a deputy's shirt, untucked and unbuttoned. His face was obscured by a wide hat and low camera angle. But the posture, the walk, was unmistakable. Shaq watched it again and again. Every angle of his mind screamed the same name, Wade McKellen. He didn't call the sheriff's department. He didn't post the footage. He forwarded it to a private investigator he'd once hired to locate a runaway teen from his youth mentorship program. Discreet. Effective. Not bound by Crestford's invisible lines. In town, opinions split like cracked pavement. Some mourned with him, openly dropping off cards and notes, kids drawing pictures of the yacht on paper plates. Others avoided eye contact, pretending not to see him in grocery aisles, offering soft excuses for why they hadn't reached out. A few barely concealed their relief. They called it unfortunate. They called it sad, but not unjust, not criminal, not hateful. Shaq buried the grief beneath motion. He started spending more time at the community center, rebuilt schedules, restructured workshops. He didn't stop, but something inside him had shifted. Where once he had trusted the town to hold itself accountable, now he saw the brittle truth. Some people would rather burn hope than share it. The fire hadn't taken lives, but it had sent a message, and Shaq had received it. He didn't tell anyone what he planned next. Not Miara, not Lucille. He knew the road ahead wasn't about retribution. It was about exposure. If the system wouldn't acknowledge what had been lost, he would make it impossible to ignore. What they destroyed was physical. What he would build next couldn't be touched by flames. Still, every night he returned to the dock, to the spot where Lucille's dream had once rocked gently in the tide. He stared out at the blackened waterline, and imagined it whole again. Not as it was, but as it could be, reborn from the ashes of hate, into something undeniable. The smoke had cleared, but the fire had only just begun. Shaq had always believed that the truth had a voice, but in Crestford, that voice spoke in whispers, carefully, cautiously, like a creature afraid to be hunted. In the days following the fire, the marina smelled not of salt water, but of soot and silence. Officials offered platitudes. The sheriff's department issued a single press release, citing preliminary evidence of accidental ignition. There was no apology, no empathy. The town moved on as if nothing had happened. But Shaq didn't. He wasn't a man of paranoia. He was deliberate, patient. Years of playing on the court under pressure had taught him the value of timing and observation. And so, without spectacle or headlines, he began his own investigation. Not with lawyers or press conferences, but with conversation. The first person he turned to was Luther Briggs, a Vietnam veteran who lived in a rusted-out van behind the bait shack near the marina. Most folks ignored Luther. They called him Crazy Lou, said he talked to ghosts and smoked too much of the wrong things. But Shaq knew better. Luther had the eyes of someone who'd seen too much to speak simply. He kept watch over the dock like a soldier guarding a long-forgotten post. Shaq brought him fresh coffee one morning, and sat beside him on the curb without a word. Luther eventually spoke, not looking at him. Saw a man leave the dock early. Day of the fire. Didn't walk like a dockhand. Walked like someone who thinks the ground owes him. Shaq turned slightly. You remember what he wore? Luther nodded. Slow and deliberate. Khaki shirt. Heavy boots. and he didn't look back. Shaq thanked him, handed him an envelope, and stood to leave. Luther stopped him with a question that lingered. They think we can't see from the margins. But sometimes, that's the only place the whole picture shows. Next was Jenna Morales, a cleaner at the municipal building who'd quietly volunteered at some of Shaq's programs. She'd always been quick with a smile, quieter with her thoughts. He found her after hours near the service entrance, scrubbing down equipment no one thanked her for. She didn't flinch when he asked her plainly if she'd heard anything unusual on the radios that morning. Her hands paused only for a moment before she nodded. Someone said, "Operations complete. Pull back from the East Pier." It was early, before sunrise. I didn't understand what it meant. I thought it was about a drill. She looked over her shoulder, voice lowering. But it wasn't on our frequency. It came from the sheriff's channel. I only heard it because someone didn't switch back before they stepped away. I wasn't supposed to hear it. Shaq promised her protection, though they both knew protection in Crestford was a fragile concept. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to form, but not into a picture he expected. Late one night, he returned to his office to sift through archived financial statements for the foundation. What had started as an emotional ritual, a way to reconnect to purpose, turned sharply when he noticed irregularities in the disbursement reports. Payments marked as logistics had been made to a shell company tied to an out-of-town contractor. There were duplicate invoices, and more disturbingly, a transfer request marked urgent, dated 2 days before the fire, signed by someone he trusted, Nolan Grave. Nolan had been with Shaq since the beginning of his charity work. A polished Ivy League strategist with a talent for networking and securing grants. Nolan was the type of man who smiled with all the right teeth and never left a conversation without shaking every hand. He was Mira's godfather. He was part of the family. But something didn't add up. Nolan had pushed hard for expansion, buying waterfront property near the marina to convert into learning centers. He insisted it would increase impact, generate local investment, expand influence. What Shaq hadn't realized was that Nolan had been quietly buying shares in the redevelopment companies, bidding for those very properties. If the yacht program failed, if the marina fell into disrepair or disuse, the land's value would skyrocket for commercial bidders. For Nolan, Lucille's dream wasn't just a boat. It was an obstacle. That betrayal cut deeper than any hate from outside. It was one thing to battle a system rigged against you. It was another to be sabotaged from within by someone who claimed to share your mission. Shaq sat in the dark of his office. The documents fanned out across his desk like evidence in a silent trial. Outside, the wind rattled the flags over the marina, and the water shifted restlessly under the dock's ruined edge. There was a new question now. Had Nolan acted alone, or had he made a quiet alliance with the one man Shaq had already suspected? In the days that followed, Shaq widened his net. He met with a retired dispatcher from the sheriff's department, a woman named Thelma, who'd relocated to Tallahassee after her own complaints were buried under procedural issues. She spoke with quiet anger, describing how certain calls were redirected if they came from the black side of town, how officers like Wade McKellen were shielded from internal reviews. "He thinks he's the gatekeeper," she said. "He doesn't just enforce the law, he filters it." By the end of the week, Shaq had mapped out a quiet conspiracy of silence and self-interest. Wade had motive, Nolan had means. And somewhere in between, someone had used access to harm what couldn't be bought. He didn't confront them. Not yet. That wasn't his style. Instead, he documented everything. Quietly, methodically. And when he returned to Luther, handing him an envelope with 2 printed photos, one of the blurry figure from the wildlife cam, and the other of Nolan stepping out of a courthouse in Jacksonville, Luther just nodded and said, "Told you, edges see everything." Shaq knew the next move wouldn't be his alone. He would need help from people with reach. Lawyers, investigators, reporters. But this wasn't just about proving who lit the fire. It was about exposing the rot that let it happen without consequence. The town had always taught its people to speak softly when truth involved the badge, or a bank. But Shaq wasn't built for silence. Not anymore. The story was no longer about a yacht. It was about trust, about betrayal, and about the courage to say aloud what Crestford had long buried under charm and tradition. And this time the truth wasn't whispering. It was knocking. Long before Wade McKellen ever fastened a badge to his chest, he had already inherited a sense of authority, passed down like an heirloom polished with bitterness. His childhood home sat on the south edge of Crestford, A white brick ranch house with a flagpole in the yard, and a gun rack over the fireplace. The walls whispered old codes. Strength was silence, emotion was weakness, and control was everything. Wade's father, Sheriff Emmett McKellen, had served 3 consecutive terms during one of the most racially charged eras in town history. Emmett wasn't just a lawman, he was a man obsessed with preserving an order where the color of your skin dictated your place, your value, your right to speak. Back in the summer of 1989, when Shaq was still rising, and Lucille O'Neill had just begun her grassroots work in community organizing, Emmett had tried to shut down a civil rights education event she was leading. The event, hosted on church grounds and attended by both Black and Latino families, had stirred the sheriff's attention, not because of permits or noise complaints, but because it dared to teach young people their rights. Emmett issued a notice citing fire code violations and attempted to block access with department cruisers, but Lucille didn't flinch. She stood at the front of the church steps, calm but unwavering, while community leaders called in reporters from Jacksonville. The story went statewide. Emmett backed down, red-faced and vengeful. It was the first public failure in his otherwise ironclad career, and it left a stain that never quite faded from the family's story. Wade had been a teenager then, standing off to the side during the confrontation, watching his father's jaw lock, and his mother refuse to meet his eyes. He didn't understand the weight of it, only that power had been questioned, and his family had come out second. In the McKellen household, that wasn't just a loss, it was a betrayal of legacy. Years later, Wade wore the badge not as a vow to protect, but as a means to restore what he believed his father had lost. He joined the force in his early 20s, passed every exam, played by the book at least on paper. He never raised his voice, never left paperwork unfinished. He knew how to present professionalism, but underneath the uniform was a heart welded shut by resentment. There was another shadow in Wade's life that shaped him, a brother named Lucas, 2 years older, wilder, gentler. Lucas had no interest in legacy. He played music, worked part-time construction, and spent more time in black neighborhoods than his parents could stomach. He once fell in love with a girl named Kendra from the east side of town. Emmett threatened to kick him out over it. Lucas didn't care. He moved out instead. For a while he drifted between jobs, trying to figure out who he was without the badge or the name. In 2002, Lucas died of a heroin overdose in the back alley of a music hall near the Crestford line, an area most deputies referred to with disdain and disregard. Wade was the one who got the call. When he arrived, the scene was cold, the cleanup already underway. The officer on duty had filed it away as just another junkie call. No investigation, no real follow-up, no questions about where the drugs came from or why Lucas had spiraled in the first place. Wade blamed the neighborhood, blamed the culture, blamed everyone except the systems that had failed his brother long before that needle ever touched his skin. He returned to work the next week harder, colder, more precise, but the grief had twisted into something venomous, something that wore the badge not to serve but to dominate. By the time Shaq arrived in Crestford and began building his marina program, Wade had already solidified his image. The quiet enforcer, the one who didn't speak much, but made sure things stayed in order. He saw Shaq's arrival, not as a gesture of hope, but as a challenge. Another outsider, another attempt to shift the balance, and worse, it was working. What stung most wasn't just Shaq's popularity. It was the respect he earned without ever demanding it. Wade had spent his career enforcing compliance, and here was a man who walked freely, welcomed, celebrated. It reminded him too much of Lucas, the ease with which people of all backgrounds gravitated toward him, the way boundaries dissolved when they laughed, the humanity they shared. Wade hated it, not because it was wrong, but because it reminded him of all the things he had buried. The file on Lucille's dreams sat on Wade's desk for weeks before the fire. He had read it thoroughly. The permits, the fundraising summaries, the educational outlines. It was clean, bulletproof. But that made him suspicious. No one did this kind of work without a crack somewhere, and Wade wanted that crack. He wanted to prove that Shaq was just like everyone else, flawed, fallible, overstepping. But as the community rallied around the yacht, as the kids wrote letters and painted murals and shared their dreams with cameras rolling, Wade began to feel the shift slipping from his hands. His father's voice haunted him in those moments. Control the narrative, or the narrative controls you. And yet, despite every effort to discredit or stall Shaq's work, it kept growing, until the fire. He hadn't planned the fire. That part had taken on a life of its own. Someone else had moved forward with the act. But Wade hadn't stopped it. He'd ignored red flags, chosen not to report suspicious movement near the dock, let the rumors of an accident settle rather than pushing for answers. Inaction had been his shield, and his weapon. When the footage emerged, the blurry figure walking from the dock before sunrise, Wade's name wasn't attached. But his gait, his build, his silence, they whispered louder than any voice. And now, the whispers were growing. He could feel the town watching him differently. Not openly. Not yet. But the silence no longer protected him the way it once had. Even those within the department began to step back, to leave him alone in meetings, to avoid eye contact when old cases came up. His badge still hung on his chest, but its weight had changed. It no longer signified control. It reminded him of Lucas, of failure, of the long rotting legacy he had never fully escaped. Wade sat alone in his office one evening, the lights low, the door locked. He stared at a photograph of his father in uniform, arm around a young Wade in the same tan shirt. They had both smiled then. But looking at it now, all he saw was the wound. The badge had never healed it. It had only hidden it better. And as the tide shifted outside the sheriff's department, as truth began to press at the cracks he'd spent a lifetime sealing, Wade McKellen began to realize something he'd never admitted before. Power can protect a lie, but it can't erase it. And in Crestford, the lie was finally unraveling. He presented himself as the perfect bridge, an educated white man, with the right connections, eager to help Shaq translate vision into impact. He brought in donors, charmed politicians, and kept the foundation's books as pristine as a luxury dealership showroom. But beneath that charm was a calculation that Shaq had overlooked. The truth came quietly, not as a thunderclap, but a breadcrumb. It began with a call from a journalist out of Tampa, a woman named Rena Broxton, who had covered real estate corruption for nearly a decade. She had been tracking irregular property acquisitions along coastal towns where nonprofit-run land was suddenly being reclaimed, rezoned, and sold off for resort development. Shaq wasn't on her radar until Lucille's dream burned. Then a familiar name popped up on her desk, Nolan Graves. He had been in preliminary talks with the same development firm buying up distressed coastal properties across the southeast. Rena didn't accuse, didn't speculate. She just sent Shaq a single PDF, an offer letter dated the day before the fire, addressed to Nolan's holding company. The language was sterile. Intent to pursue land assets following the anticipated shift in charitable operations. But the number wasn't sterile. It was 7 figures. Shaq read the letter 3 times, his hands unmoving, his breath slow. He'd seen betrayal before, but never one dressed in this much professionalism. He didn't confront Nolan immediately. He needed more than instinct. He needed clarity. The next move was subtle. Shaq requested a back-channel audit, not a legal investigation, just a quiet review by an outside firm. Within a week it confirmed more than he wanted to know. Nolan had set up a shadow company 6 months earlier. Through it he'd positioned himself to inherit the marina property if the foundation were forced to dissolve its operational assets. The paperwork was legal, clean, and buried behind 3 layers of bureaucracy. But the motive was visible now. Nolan didn't need Lucille's dream to fail. He needed it to disappear. The final blow came when Shaq reviewed the yacht's scheduling system. Only 3 people had access to its dock logs and route updates. Shaq himself, the operations manager, and Nolan. The schedule that revealed the yacht's planned activity the day of the fire had been sent out by Nolan's email at 2:17 a.m., marked as a routine, internal update. But it wasn't routine. The kids weren't even confirmed for arrival until noon. No one else had reason to send that out. Shaq didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study, staring at the old leather-bound journal, where he kept reflections, prayers, goals. It had always helped him center his thoughts. But that night, the words didn't come. Only one question echoed. How long had Nolan been planning this? Their next meeting took place at the Foundation's downtown office, where glass windows stretched over the bay, and the conference room smelled of espresso and expensive ink. Nolan entered with his usual swagger. Tie loose, voice light. He started talking about recovery plans, media strategy, rebuilding optics. He never asked how Shaq was coping. He didn't have to. His smile had already said he wasn't. Shaq let him finish. Then, with the same calm he once used to dominate courts full of shouting fans, Shaq slid the printout of the offer letter across the table. Nolan didn't react at first. His eyes read the page, but his face stayed neutral, a performance well practiced. I trusted you, Shaq said. It wasn't anger, it was something worse, disappointment. Full and still. Nolan cleared his throat, leaned back, reached for language that might redirect the fall. It's just business positioning, man. I wasn't gonna act on it unless things got. Shaq raised a hand. Unless what? Unless my boat burned? Unless the community folded? Unless we failed and you profited? Nolan didn't have an answer. And for the first time in their partnership, he didn't try to fake one. Shaq stood. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He only said what needed to be said. You're done here. By the end of the day, Nolan's access was revoked. Legal teams were activated. Quiet calls were made to the board. But the damage had already settled in places. Harder to clean. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the implications that the fire wasn't just about hate. It was about money. Greed had crept in through the front door, dressed in suits and smiles, and waited for a moment of weakness. That night, as Shaq drove past the marina, still blackened, still silent, he realized the war he was in wasn't just against racism. It was against erosion. The slow, quiet disintegration of trust from within, and the only way to win wasn't to yell louder. It was to rebuild stronger, so strong that no one could twist his mission into profit, ever again. Crestford had taught him that enemies didn't always wear badges. Sometimes they wore name tags at banquets, and said they believed in you. But belief without integrity was just a sales pitch, and Shaq had no time left for salesmen. Crestford had always worn politeness like a uniform, neat, ironed and pressed close to the skin. It was a town where smiles outlasted eye contact, where church pews filled every Sunday but charity stayed within invisible lines. The houses were painted in pastel tones, and porches were decorated with rocking chairs and American flags, but underneath the charm lived an unspoken order. Outsiders were tolerated, not welcomed, and success was only celebrated when it didn't challenge the architecture of who got to have it. When Shaq first arrived, most people had assumed he'd stay a few months, maybe a year. They figured he'd donate to a school, cut a ribbon, take some photos, and disappear back into a gated community far from the heart of town. But he didn't. He bought property. He hired locals. He showed up at town halls and took meetings without cameras. He helped reopen a struggling recreational center, and funded scholarships that bore his mother's name instead of his own. And worse, at least in the eyes of some, he didn't do it quietly. His kindness echoed, but not all echoes are welcome. At first the resistance came in the form of red tape. Permits delayed. Zoning laws suddenly reinterpreted. Then came passive complaints about traffic, about noise at the marina, about the changing character of the neighborhood. It wasn't overt. That wasn't Crestford's style. Instead, it showed up in phone calls not returned, contractors suddenly unavailable, neighborhood associations whispering about preserving tradition. Shaq had noticed it. Of course he had. But he'd always believed that action could change minds, that generosity could erode suspicion. He kept working, kept giving. But as the yacht smoldered in ashes and the investigation stalled without urgency, something began to fracture in him. He walked through town differently now. The same diners that once offered him extra coffee now avoided eye contact. The same city officials who'd once posed for photos with Lucille's dream quietly removed framed letters from his foundation from their office walls. Even local news outlets, once enthusiastic about covering his programs, now treated the fire like a minor incident, an unfortunate event with no need for follow-up. And then came the final signal, a petition, circulating under the guise of economic redevelopment, calling for the city to reassess use of coastal land for high-value projects. The language was coded, but the intent was clear: make room for investors, not intervention. The town wasn't just moving on without him, it was trying to erase what he'd built. Shaq sat in his truck one afternoon, parked near the cemetery where his mother's parents were buried. He watched the wind bend the Spanish moss in slow, sorrowful waves, and felt a weight settle on his shoulders, one heavier than any gain loss or business setback. It was the ache of realizing that sometimes, the fight isn't against one man, or even one office. It's against the very soil, the culture, the inheritance passed down not through law, but through silence. He had thought the enemy was Wade McKellen, or Nolan, or the arsonist, but now he saw the broader truth. The fire wasn't an act of hatred by one hand. It was the result of a town that never truly believed he belonged, not because of what he did, but because of what he represented. Black success. Visible. Generous. Unapologetic. That's what stung them most. The system here didn't fear disruption. It feared transformation. Shaq had come with a heart full of mission. But the town had never opened its doors, only its wallet, briefly, while watching with suspicion from behind lace curtains. He thought about Mimara, about the stories he'd told her growing up, about how hard work and love could win over any room. He wondered now if that was naive. If maybe the truth was harsher, that sometimes love alone isn't enough to change history, especially when that history is actively defended. He thought about the kids who'd come aboard Lucille's dream, the ones who had smiled like they finally belonged somewhere. Had he lied to them, even unintentionally? Had he given them hope in a place that had already decided their worth? That night, he returned to the marina, where the air still held the scent of burned fiberglass and oil. He walked to the water's edge and looked at the blackened posts, still standing like charred bones. The dock was silent, except for the small rustle of tide against wood. He could still hear laughter in that silence, the echoes of what had been. It hurt. He sat on the edge and let the weight in his chest rise. Not anger, not even sorrow, doubt. For the first time since the fire, he wondered if all of it had been for nothing. If the money, the programs, the years spent lifting others, had simply been swept away like smoke. Maybe some places didn't want saving. Maybe some stories weren't meant to change. The thought stayed with him as he drove home that night. Headlights cutting through the empty streets, Crestford had made itself clear. This wasn't about one building, or one dream. It was about territory. And in the minds of many, Shaq had crossed a line he was never meant to approach. It wasn't just that he had built something. It was that he had built it without permission. And in Crestford, that was the ultimate sin. Instead of retribution, he chose something else. Memory. A memorial. He announced it quietly. A single press release sent not to national outlets, but to local radio, community bulletins, church networks. The headline was simple. We remember what floated us. The event would be held on a Saturday morning at the marina. No ticket, no RSVP, just presence. As the day approached, word spread faster than expected. Within 48 hours, invitations were being reposted by activists, civil rights groups, and educators. Parents whose children had spent time on Lucille's dream wrote open letters, sharing stories of healing and first chances. People began arriving from across the state, some from across the country. What had started as a local gathering was becoming something else, something harder to dismiss. Shaq arrived early that morning in a charcoal suit, no tie. He stood alone at the edge of the dock, staring at the blackened beams still jutting from the water, like fractured teeth. The foundation team had set up folding chairs in rows, draped banners with the yacht's name in soft blues and golds. A table stood to the side, covered with photographs. Children smiling, teens holding books, moments that had once floated quietly on those waters. By mid-morning, the crowd had doubled, then tripled. Local families sat beside former NBA players, community pastors beside city planners. But Shaq didn't take the podium first. Instead, he stepped aside for voices that rarely got a mic. One by one, victims of police harassment and racially motivated injustice came forward. A mother from Miami, whose son had been stopped without cause 48 times before his 20th birthday. A retired teacher, whose community center had been shut down after she refused to remove a mural of Malcolm X. A former youth counselor, who'd been fired for speaking out against racial profiling in public schools. Each story chipped away at the silence that Crestford had spent decades building. Then Shaq stepped up. He didn't read from notes. He didn't have a speechwriter behind him. He looked at the crowd, not with the gaze of a celebrity, but of a father and neighbor, a man who had lost something sacred, and began. I didn't come here today to tell you I'm angry, he said. I came to tell you I'm awake. His voice was low, steady, not dramatic, but filled with weight. I built Lucille's dream because I believed we could make a space that floated above hate. Not because hate doesn't exist, but because kids deserve 1 hour, just 1 hour, where they feel safe, feel seen. I didn't expect thanks. I didn't expect praise. But I did expect decency, and when that boat burned, something else burned with it. He paused, the wind brushing across the microphone. I thought if I did enough good, this town would see my heart. But now I realize, some people don't want to see, they want to stay blind, and silence is their comfort. Then he leaned closer, voice almost a whisper, but the kind that silences an entire crowd. But I'm not here to comfort anyone. I'm here to remind us that just because we speak softly doesn't mean we're weak. This right here, this gathering. This is what power looks like when it remembers what it lost. The clip went viral within hours, shared by athletes, artists, activists. It became a headline not because it was angry, but because it was undeniable. No slogans, no demands, just truth, spoken clean. And while the internet carried his words across the country, something else surfaced behind the scenes. A plain envelope arrived at the Crestford Gazette 2 days after the memorial. No return address. Inside were screenshots. Internal Sheriff's Department communications dated the week of the fire. One thread in particular stood out. It read, "Let the fire do its work. Delay any outside requests until I greenlight." Another read, "Contain the narrative. Blame it on faulty wiring. No follow-up." The sender had blacked out names, but the email signatures were unmistakable to anyone familiar with the department. It didn't prove who lit the fire, but it proved someone knew and helped bury it. The Gazette published the screenshots. Larger outlets picked it up within hours, and for the first time the people of Crestford weren't being asked to speculate. They were being forced to reckon. Back at the marina, Shaq stood once again at the edge of the dock, this time beside Marat and Lucille. No press, no crowd, just family. He knew this didn't undo what was done. It didn't rebuild the yacht. It didn't remove the rot in the system. But it cracked something. A silence had been broken, and with every voice that joined his, the roar grew louder. Not violent, not chaotic, but persistent. A quiet roar, and it wasn't going away. For most of his career, Wade McKellen had moved through Crestford like a man wrapped in armor, untouchable, unreadable, protected by the layers of history, loyalty, and fear that had cemented his place in the town's quiet hierarchy. He had never been forced to explain himself, never been required to answer hard questions. But the leaks changed everything. The screenshots published by the Gazette didn't just confirm suspicion, they detonated denial. It was no longer just a community grievance or a local scandal. It was evidence, and evidence invited accountability. Within days, the Department of Justice dispatched investigators to Crestford. Wade wasn't publicly arrested. That wasn't how this town worked. Instead, the sheriff's office issued a statement saying he'd been placed on administrative leave pending review, a phrase that attempted to soften the truth. But in the silence that followed, the walls began to close in. Officers who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Wade now avoided his gaze. Files he once controlled were taken over by federal agents. His name, once spoken with deference, became a cautionary tale, whispered through hallways and council chambers. And perhaps worst of all, his own family, relatives still rooted in Crestford, stopped picking up his calls. The legacy he had tried to protect had slipped between his fingers, not with a bang, but with a quiet unraveling. Nolan Graves, on the other hand, didn't wait around for a formal fall. Within 24 hours of the leaked emails hitting the news, he was on a one-way flight to Portland, leaving behind his downtown condo and a half-finished luxury development project that had already started losing investors. The foundation issued a statement distancing itself from Nolan, citing deep ethical concerns and confirming his permanent removal. The man who once stood beside Shaq at ribbon cuttings now existed only in old photos and redacted legal documents. But Shaq didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. There were no "I told you so" interviews, no victory laps. That wasn't his way. Instead, he stood in front of reporters at a press conference held beside the charred marina and introduced something new: Lucille's legacy. He spoke softly, but with clarity. This isn't about replacing what was lost. It's about taking what we learned and carrying it forward. The initiative was bold, ambitious, and already underway. Rather than rebuild another yacht, Shaq was funding a fleet of mobile learning centers, refurbished buses outfitted with books, technology, mentorship stations, and mental health support. They would travel across the country, especially into towns like Crestford, places where children were too often forgotten or written off. The learning would float again, not on water this time, but on wheels. He named the project, not after himself, but after his mother. Lucille stood beside him as he made the announcement, her hand in his, eyes glassy with pride. She had watched her son be torn down by a town that once pretended to embrace him, and now she watched him rebuild, not in defiance but in grace. The story gained national traction. News anchors ran retrospective segments on Lucille's dream, Interviews aired with former students who had been on the yacht, and opinion pieces praised Shaq's restraint and resolve. Social media carried his message across generations. Hashtags trended, celebrities offered support, donations poured in. But more than money, people offered something rarer: solidarity. Crestford, meanwhile, found itself exposed. Local elections saw record turnout. Long-seated officials declined to run for re-election. And in an unexpected move driven by a petition started by high school students, the town council voted unanimously to rename the waterfront park. The new name, Lucille O'Neill Harbor Green. The vote wasn't just symbolic, it was an admission that something had broken, and maybe something better could be built in its place. The sign was unveiled at sunrise, without cameras, just a small gathering of townsfolk who had quietly supported Shaq from the start. No speeches, just a moment of stillness, as if the town itself exhaled something it had been holding for far too long. Shaq stood on the edge of the new park days. Later, watching kids from the community play near the same waters that had once carried his dream. He didn't think of the fire. He didn't think of Wade or Nolan. He thought of his mother's hands folding letters in the kitchen, of Mira sketching her first vision of the yacht, of the little boy who once cried on the lower deck because it was the first time he'd ever felt safe. Redemption, Shaq realized, didn't require revenge. It required remembrance. He walked along the paved path, now lined with benches engraved with quotes from civil rights leaders, and paused at a plaque near the dock. It read, "In honor of all who kept dreaming, even when the world told them not to." That's what Lucille's legacy would carry now, not the weight of a burned boat, but the breath of something resilient, something that couldn't be sunk or sold. The shield that once protected the old way had fallen, not through noise, not through riots, but through a roar quiet enough to echo across an entire nation. The marina didn't look the same, but Shaq wasn't trying to make it look the same. The charred boards had been replaced by fresh cedar planks stained by hands of volunteers, teachers, local carpenters, former students of the yacht's programs. No one asked to be paid, they asked only to be part of it. The name wasn't written in steel this time, but carved gently into the wood with care and precision. Lucille's dream too. It wasn't about starting over, it was about continuing what refused to end. The yacht was smaller than the original. Less shine, more heart. Gone were the sleek metallic hulls and ultra-modern glass railings. In their place were painted murals along the inner walls, stories told by the children who had once learned to dream on the deck of the original. One panel showed a rising phoenix made of books and waves. Another depicted hands of every shade, lifting a boy toward the sun. Every image was a vow. Shaq stood quietly on the deck, the morning of its first sail, looking out over a bay that had once held smoke. Now it held something else: stillness. Not silence, but peace. This yacht had been built piece by piece, with community sweat and second chances. A retired boatwright came out of decades of seclusion to design the frame. A single mother who once attended a workshop on Lucille's dream ran the logistics. Teenagers from the high school volunteered to paint, install, and organize the shelves. Every bolt, every panel, every line of code in the new digital library bore the fingerprints of those who had once been told they didn't belong here. Shaq didn't deliver a grand speech. He didn't invite a news crew. There were no fireworks, no camera drones hovering for social media content. There were just people sitting in folding chairs on the dock, hands clutching lemonade cups and soft paper napkins, eyes filled with gratitude and quiet awe. As the yacht drifted from the dock, pushed gently by the tide, Mimara stood beside her father. She had helped draft the new education model for Lucille's legacy, mapping out stops in neglected districts across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. She wasn't a kid anymore. She had grown into something fierce and focused, a reflection not just of her father's strength, but of Lucille's resolve. Lucille, too, stood on the dock, her arm linked with a woman who had once marched with her in the 80s, and still remembered the look on Sheriff Emmett McKellen's face when their civil rights rally pushed through his blockade. The park now bore her name. She never wanted the honor, but she accepted it on behalf of every mother who had to teach her son how to survive instead of simply how to live. The yacht moved slowly along the waterline, gliding without sound. Inside, the main room held a single wooden bench in front of a large window. On it, carved in Lucille's handwriting, was a phrase she'd often repeated to Shaq in his lowest moments. "Don't let them shrink you to fit their comfort." As the vessel turned toward the horizon, the sun began to set. It cast a golden ribbon across the surface of the water, The kind of light that didn't demand attention but gave it anyway. Shaq leaned against the rail, feeling the wind press softly against his skin. This wasn't the end of anything. If anything, it was the beginning of something freer, something lighter. He thought of Wade McKellen, not with rage, but with distance. The system that had protected him had finally begun to rust. Shaq didn't need to see justice in handcuffs. He saw it in the boy who now stood on the deck reading aloud to his younger sister. He saw it in the girl who pointed at the stars and said, "I'm going to be up there one day." And he thought of Nolan, not because of the betrayal, but because of what it proved, that not all enemies wear uniforms. Some wear loyalty like camouflage. But even that lesson had shaped him, had made him build with better steel, with wiser eyes. As the yacht moved farther from shore, the dock grew small behind them. But the laughter carried. It floated, just like the dream. The nation hadn't changed overnight. Racism didn't vanish with a yacht rebuilt. Systems didn't crumble because one man stood his ground. But change had come, in inches, in waves, in soft, stubborn resistance. Shaq closed his eyes and breathed in the salt air. He didn't need applause. He didn't need headlines. All he needed was the quiet hum of the water beneath him, and the feeling that something sacred was back where it belonged. Alive. The yacht's engine barely made a sound, and as it carried them into that golden stretch between day and night, his voice played over the small intercom, a simple message he'd pre-recorded, played only for the passengers aboard. Sometimes they try to burn down your hope. But hope don't sink. It floats. If this story moved you, don't just remember it, reflect it. Talk about it at your table. Teach it in your classrooms. Build something in your own town that can't be bought, bullied, or burned. The fight for dignity isn't won by watching. It's won by showing up where silence once lived.